Thank you all for being here for our third and final installment of the Breastfeeding Virtual Learning Series. Tonight we'll be exploring questions, issues, and halachic things, social things around breastfeeding in public, in synagogue, and while learning. Again, I want to invite everyone, if you can, to turn your camera on. It's much more enjoyable for us to be able to see your faces and get to know one another in that way. If you have questions throughout our evening together, I want to invite you to put them into the chat and I'll make sure that they get to the proper speaker. We are so grateful to be partnering this evening with both JOFA and Svivah. So thank you to both of those fantastic organizations for helping to support this evening of learning. We are going to get started with Rabbanit Jennifer Geretz.
Thank you, Jennifer. Good evening, and I'm so glad to be a part of this final segment of the wonderful learning series on Judaism and breastfeeding. I have been so impressed by the collective wisdom and empowered Torah learning shared during this series. I have noticed that most of our speakers have prefaced their remarks with "fed is best," reassuring participants that we fully support however parents choose to feed their babies. If this is so obvious, why do so many of us feel the need to restate it? I still struggle with the answer to this question. I birthed and fed 4 wonderful boys. My first child exclusively and easily nursed. However, each pregnancy and birth are different. Because of my misplaced determination to exclusively feed my second son with what turned out to be a low supply of non-nutritive breast milk, he ended up with a stay in the NICU and a delayed Brit Milah. I was working closely with my pediatrician and also with a lovely volunteer from La Leche League. All of us were very well educated, experienced, and had only the best of intentions. Yet at the end of the day, I had a child who spent 3 weeks bright orange, 1.5 pounds below his birth weight, and without any body fat, before I realized that he needed formula. Thank God he recovered very quickly once he finally got enough to eat. Although he spent his childhood below every growth curve, he is now almost 6 feet tall and Amir Tashem graduating college this year. I still struggle to understand what I was thinking. What makes the idea of nursing so powerful that we have to reassure each other that it's okay to give our children what they need to grow, even if it isn't breast milk? There's something about the emotional pull of nursing that defies explanation, that transcends the physical, that causes so many of us to agonize and second guess about how we choose to sustain our children. Tonight, I want to bring a beautiful midrash about how Judaism looks at the spiritual component of nursing and see if we can learn more about why we care so much about how our children receive nourishment. Our midrash is from Pesik Rabbati in chapter 43, and I did post this into the chat. I posted it, it's a document in Google Drive. I posted the text that I'm going to be reading the English for. I could not find English for this, so the translation is mine. So if any of you have corrections or suggestions for an alternate read, I'm very happy to hear them. I put my email in the Google Drive doc, and I am open to any of your comments and other interpretations. But the English that I'm going to read is going to be mine. The Pesik Rabbati is a midrashic work that originated in Israel around 845 Common Era. And it's arranged according to the cycle of weekday and holiday Torah and Haftarah readings. Our midrash is discussing Chana's story that we found in the Haftarah. We read this Haftarah on the first day of Rosh Hashanah. It's taken from Shmuel Aleph. Our text is briefly discussing Sara Imenu, and we read this about Sara Imenu in the Torah reading on the first day of Rosh Hashanah. So this is how it begins, our section. An alternative interpretation of God took note of Chana, etc. This is, as the verse states, he sets the childless woman among her household as a happy mother of children. Said the Holy Blessed One, I set Sara barren in her home, as it says, and Sarai was barren, in order to gladden her with children, because Sara had many children. However, behold, Sara gave birth only to Yitzchak alone, as it is written, and Sara conceived and gave birth to Abraham, a son of his old age. So what is this happy with her children, plural? Rather, when Sara gave birth to Yitzchak, the nations of the world said that he, Yitzchak, must be the child of a servant girl, and she is just pretending to nurse him herself. At the same time, an anonymous speaker said to her, Sara, how can you just stand there and hear this false claim? This isn't the time for modesty. Instead, stand up and uncover yourself for the sake of sanctifying Hashem's name. Sara uncovered herself, and her 2 breasts emptied forth milk like 2 gushing springs of water. As it is written in Bereshit 21:7, and Sara said, who would have said to Abraham that Sara would nurse children? Rabbi Pinchas HaKohen, the son of Chama, said the name of Rav Chilkiah. Abraham's standing grain was already withered on the stalk, i.e., he was impotent. Who would tell Abraham? It was the nations of the world bringing their children to Sara to nurse them that fulfilled the verse predicting Sara would nurse children, plural. There were some among those who brought their children truly in order that she should nurse them. But there were some of them who brought their children out of curiosity, and even they did not miss out. Rav Levi said that those that truly brought their children for Sara to nurse became converts to Judaism. As it says, Sara nursed children. How can we say nursed children, plural? Because she guided them to become a part of Israel. And about even those who came out of curiosity about Sara, our rabbis say they became greater in this world via spiritual elevation. All converts who convert to Judaism in the world, and all righteous people in the world, come from those who nursed from Sara's milk. They became the children in whom she rejoices. And that's the end of the section that I excerpted. I had never seen this midrash before recently, and I was very excited to find it. And I thought that it was really lovely and very on point for our learning together in this series. Several things stand out to me from this midrash. One of the theological lenses through which the Mefarshim suggest we view biblical infertility is as a vehicle for divine intervention. The lineage of the Jewish people only came about via the direct and miraculous intervention of God into the lives of our avot and imahot. This particular midrash discusses that God opened both Chana's and Sarah's wombs so that they could conceive. We are reminded here that both Sara and Abraham had fertility challenges, age obviously being among them, and that it took divine intervention to cause 2 people beyond the age of fertility to conceive, and for Sara to carry to term and give birth. Rather than stopping with this miraculous birth, we are given this incredible image of Sara not only being able to successfully deliver a child, but apparently she has an infinite supply of breast milk, which of course, to the extent described in our midrash, could also only be miraculous. Clearly, something is going on here beyond just divine involvement in physical conception and childbearing. Chazal in this midrash want us to understand that Sara was not only a physical, but a spiritual mother. More than the milk she gave the multitude of children in this story, Sara provided spiritual sustenance as well. Sara, in this view, is not only the spiritual mother of all Jewish souls, but of all righteous people. The influence of her nursing extends not only to those physically present at this miracle, but throughout all generations. Nursing is something that transcends the physical limits of supply, of time, and even of existence, as Sara's milk reaches even those not yet born. When Jews are finished eating, we say a prayer in which we bless Hashem not only for the land, but for the land's ability to sustain us, al haaretz v'al hamazon, on the land and on the sustenance. We traditionally think of mazon not only as general sustenance, but as sustenance related to flour and flour products. But we have another way to view it as well. Think of the lyrics to Tzor Mishalau, a Shabbat Zemer in which we sing praise concerning mazon v'tzeda hisbia lenafshenu, the sustenance and provisions with which God satisfies our spirit. Nursing is not just about the food, but about the sustenance, just like in our song from Shabbat. The physical combined with the spiritual is what satisfies. In the end, the beautiful image in our Midrash wasn't only about Sarah's physical ability to nurse, but rather her ability to nourish and inspire others with her faith, her righteousness, and her leadership. When Sara nursed Yitzchak, and then, in this Midrash, all the babies, the miracle wasn't just that she gushed forth with physical milk enough to satiate so many, but that she provided spiritual food enough for all future Jewish people in whatever way they come to be Jews, and also to all righteous people. We want to nurse our babies to give them physical nutrition and also to grow their spirits. We want to completely nourish them with all of the intangible but very real spiritual sustenance that they need to grow. Yet at some point as parents, we have to face that we are ultimately not going to be the only source for either physical or spiritual sustenance. Our job is not to be the only source of sustenance, but instead to make sure our children get what they need to grow. Sometimes that will be from us. But we also need the wisdom to realize that what we have to give our children will not be all they need to grow, no matter how strong our love or pure our intentions. How wonderful it is for all of us to be able to learn Torah together, the inheritors of the spiritual nourishment lovingly provided by our holy ancestor Sara. May you each be blessed in your efforts to spiritually sustain yourselves, your families, and your communities.
Thank you, Rabbanit Geretz. That was amazing, and it was so lovely to learn Torah with you again. So with that introduction, now that we've talked about the amazing spiritual sustenance that comes from feeding babies and basically how incredible nursing and sometimes choosing not to nurse can be for so many women, I think, and parents, broadly speaking, I think it's time to take on a little bit of the halachic questions that if our ability to feed our babies is going to be limited by halacha, that's something we need to be aware of. And if it's not going to be limited by halacha, then I think that's something that needs to be recognized and understood. So what I'm going to take you through in the next few minutes, probably slightly longer than a few, are some sources dealing with the question of where one can feed a baby. We're going to particularly be dealing with the question of feeding babies in shul and breastfeeding in shul and in public, broadly speaking. So in about a minute, I'm going to put up my PowerPoint, but I also wanted to share you the source sheet. If you are the kind of person who prefers to be able to find the sources afterwards, if you would like to look up and follow along, if you don't like staring at sources on this screen and would rather look at it on a different screen, I want that to be available to you. But the source, I'm going to be picking from a few of the sources on that sheet because those are the ones that I think are most crucial. The sheet is a little bit more expansive because you never know when you're going to need a source sheet about women breastfeeding in shul, and it's always good to have one in your back pocket. So let's get started. And alrighty, so if you are also the kind of person who would like to follow along on a different device, feel free to scan the QR code with your phone. There's a really interesting problem that happens when we start looking into questions of breastfeeding in shul. And the problem is that it's really hard to find sources about it from more than 100 or so years ago. They just don't seem to exist. And there's a fair amount of speculation about why exactly that might be the case. So Rabbi Yisachar Katz, in his frankly exhaustive article on the subject, speculates that women just weren't going to shul because they were living without eruvin. And if you can't carry your baby to shul, then you just won't, breastfeeding in shul won't be a question that's going to come up, which I think is definitely a plausible question. And I also think that we have evidence that women sometimes went to shul not on Shabbat. There are stories of women who are just going to shul for Mariv in the middle of the week, and perhaps they're bringing their children, perhaps not. So I'm also going to suggest another possibility, and that is that when you don't find something in the halachic sources, that's usually because the rabbis don't think it's a question. It is possible that the reason that there is so little written about breastfeeding in shul is because for most of human history, the idea that that would be a problem didn't come up, because there was basically one way to feed babies, and that was breastfeeding. Your alternative was somebody other than the mother doing the nursing, but that was basically what you had. So now, in a world with baby food and formula and many other options, and something that I am very, very grateful for as somebody who had 2 formula-fed kids, the question then arises, okay, this is now a halachic issue. This is something that we need to find a way to answer and build a halachic framework for. How do we answer it? And to that end, I think that there are 2 questions. The first is the question of eating in shul. Can you feed a baby in shul through a bottle, through the breast, basically whatever works best for you? Can you do that? And then the second question is there a problem with women breastfeeding in shul? Is there some issue of erva, of nakedness, in uncovering one's breast in shul in order to feed a baby? So let's take on the first question first. Okay, here we go. Weirdly enough, this one is actually the one with more halachic questions. So the Tur, writing in sort of the end of the Middle Ages, is listing a bunch of things that you cannot do in shul. I've excerpted out most of them because the bit about clowning around, while broadly relevant, is not really relevant for us right now. So batei knasiot, ubatei midrashot, here are a list of things we do not do in them. Ve'ein ochlin v'shotin, we do not eat and we do not drink. And then a little while later, he says, v'talmidei chachamim mutarin lechol lishtot bahem. So scholars are allowed to eat and drink in shul, which already sets up a dichotomy of this is maybe not appropriate to the sanctity of the place, but also maybe it is. Maybe there are exceptions for some people. And then this goes back and forth in the commentaries. I've brought one of the later commentaries here for us to see, where the Taz, the Torah Zahav, is trying to understand what exactly it means to say that we don't eat and drink, but sometimes we do eat and drink. And what he explains here is these situations of absolute necessity aren't actually absolute necessity. It's when necessary, when it's important. Nirali de'orchim shari lechol sham deha'ita bisiman resamech tet de'orchin ochlim beknishta. So we see elsewhere in these monumental works of Jewish law that guests certainly can eat, not merely in the synagogue, but in the main sanctuary itself, if that's where they need to be hosted, if that's the space that's big enough to host everybody, if people are poor and don't have anywhere to go. Over and over again, we see there are exceptions to this principle, and that based on the Taz's reading of it, seems to suggest that the principle is merely, in order to create a sense of decorum, we don't treat the sanctuary of a shul like a cafe. And as soon as there's some need for an exception, we say it's fine. It's not something that has sort of a strong halachic problem. It is something rooted in our behavior and our ability to hold on to the sanctity of the place. So therefore, it's completely clear that when it comes to babies who really need to eat if they're going to be in shul, it's more than obvious that they are, among other things, guests in our sanctuaries until they can own it themselves. They are certainly Talmidei Chachamim, especially if they are attending shirim like this while nursing. And they're obviously, it's necessary. And as soon as it meets the Taz's definition of necessary, it's not a big deal. I will also add that this is not something that most of our synagogues are particularly careful about, that basically is, as long as your shul has a candy man, this is a done deal. Everyone's already eating in shul to some degree, especially young children. And I think moreover, there's actually some real value in being able to associate shul, not just with whatever the candy man is giving out this week, but also with the idea of breastfeeding and all of those amazing ideas of milk that Rabbanit Geretz was teaching us about 10 minutes ago. So, okay, that's pretty clear. It's actually, especially the way that we behave and the way that we treat our shuls, very clear that feeding a baby in shul is not the problem. So, one down, one to go. Breastfeeding in public, and in public broadly speaking, but especially including shul. So there are a number of ways to approach this, because again, these are mostly texts that are spoken about in very recent times, or are not explicitly talking about the question of breastfeeding in shul. But there are some things that we can get to when we start to switch the question away from can a woman breastfeed in shul to what might prevent a woman from breastfeeding in shul. Again, the question is erva, nakedness. How is that an issue? So we end up with going very, very far back to the Mishnah in Chala, where we see the following text. Ha'isha yoshevet v'kotzach chalta aruma. So a woman can sit and separate challah completely naked, mipnei shehi yochola lechasot atzma, aval lo ha'ish, because she is capable of covering herself, but the man is not. And the commentators say, what do you mean by covering herself? What they actually mean is she can close her legs. She can sit with her legs closed, with her genitalia unexposed, which is not possible for a man to do if he's naked. A man needs clothing in order to cover his genitalia. So he can't separate challah naked, but a woman can separate challah naked. I don't know why she would want to, but should she wish to, she absolutely could, which actually gives us two particular things. One is it tells us that the problem with doing mitzvot is exposed genitalia, not any other part of the body. And it also suggests to us that because the Mishnah and the commentaries speak only about the question of covering her genitalia and not her breasts, there's no actual issue of being aruma, of being naked, when it's merely her breasts that are exposed. The next source is actually going to take this on further. But in this source, we're moving into the realm of agadah, of stories. And stories aren't always the sources that we use for practical halacha. But what stories like this are really great for is they tell us a lot about how the rabbis think, how they relate to ideas, how they understand the world. So regardless of the fact that this story is not technically paskening, it's not telling us what the halacha ought to be, it is clearly giving us a sense of how the rabbis viewed women and nursing and praising God. Okay, so Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbis taught in a Braita. Darash Rabbi Yossi Haglili. So Rabbi Yossi Haglili expounded thus. B'sha'a sha'alu Yisrael min hayam, natnu enehem lomar shira. So when the Jewish people decided to, or when they came up from the sea after God split it for them, they chose to praise God. This is what they wanted to do. V'ketzadam rushira. And how is it that they chose to praise God? Olal mutal al birkei imo, v'tinok yonek mishadei imo. So you have babies lying on the laps of their mothers, and infants nursing from their mother's breasts. Kevan shera'u et hashchina, olel higbia tzavara'o, v'tinok shamet dad mipiv, v'amar ze eli v'yanvehu. And when they saw the divine presence, then the infants picked their necks up, which if you've ever watched an infant with head control is actually a big deal. And the babies let the breast fall from their mouth, and they said, "This is my God, and I will exalt him." Shenamar, as we learned from the pasuk, "Mipi olalim v'yonkim isadat oz." So out of the mouths of babes and sucklings, you have founded strength. All right, so first of all, I love this image of just the babies seeing God and going, wow, that is my God, and I will exalt God. And it tells us a number of things about how the rabbis understood praising God. They understood that during Shirat Hayam, during Az Yashir, there were probably women nursing. There were babies there. The entire nation was there. Praising God isn't something that you do without half of your community present. It's something you do all together. And that means women nursing, and that means babies. And it means that if the babies are singing while nursing, and the mothers are singing while nursing. This is something that was clearly understood to be part of a divine moment, a divine expression of tefillah, basically. And so clearly the rabbis don't see it as a problem that the babies were nursing. They didn't say, oh, and the mothers made sure to cover up before the babies recited Shirat Hayam. No, that was all part of it. It was something normal for them. So from the stories, we begin to get a glimpse into the worldview of the rabbis, how they understood nursing, and the degree to which it was just for them basically a normal part of life. And given that Az Yashir is now part of davening, as my daughter constantly likes to remind me, then it seems like a pretty clear indication that at least the rabbis of the Gemara had no problem with tefillah and nursing, with tefillah and communal praise happening at the same time. So I could ask the question of what happened. We could end up doing several dissertations worth of history on the subject. We are not going to do that. We are going to fast forward ahead to the 19th century to a rabbi known as to an author known as the Ben Ish Chai. So he is writing a response on the question of body parts that are ordinarily covered. And this, I think, finishes this strands that I'm drawing out in halacha of how halacha relates to women's breasts, specifically nursing women's breasts. And right here, he's attempting to explain the rules for netilat yadayim, for washing your hands and for not having to wash your hands. And the rule he brings down here has to do with when you need to rinse your hands after having touched a covered body part. So he's about to list the relevant body parts. Ve'elu hadvarim she'ein tzrichim netila ki im rechitza kol dehu. Dahainu shitul yadav pam achat mishum nikiyut ve'elu hem. So these are the things that don't require like a full netilat yadayim back, forth, but that merely require a rinsing, just like that you wash them off once merely for cleanliness purposes. And these are them. We now have a long list that I have left out here because it does not fit on the slide. And then we pick up again. וכן הדדים בזמן שמנקת את בנה, שדרכם להיות מגולים תמיד, אם נגע בהן אין צריכה רחיצה. And so to the breasts, at the time when she is nursing her child, that is the time when they are always revealed or always exposed. And if she touches them, if she happens to touch them, she doesn't even need to wash her hands. They are not considered a covered body part. אבל אם אינה מנקת, שדרכן להיות מכוסות אותן לגמרי, אז הם בכלל מקומות המכוסין וצריכה רחיצה אם נגע בהם. However, if she's not nursing, if this is not a time when she is in the process of feeding her child using them, then that is a time when the breasts are habitually covered. And so if she touches them, then she does need to go rinse her hands afterwards because she touched a covered body part. I think the Ben Ish Chai is picking up on something that is experientially true for any woman who has attempted to nurse, which is that one's breasts take on a different category. They no longer feel private in the same way. For many of us, they felt like they belonged to someone else. Those of us who nurse may have had that experience that privacy is a thing of the past. Bodily autonomy was kind of a thing of the past, even though you were really looking forward to getting most of your body back after pregnancy was over. They're not the same. It's just a different experience. And the Ben Ish Chai recognizes not only that experience that women have, but that experience actually has a halachic ramification. It causes a change in status in a person's breast when they're nursing from them. And I think that that's really important. I think that halacha recognizes that actually when women are nursing, when people are nursing, there's actually something different. There's something going on that changes reality. And when reality changes, halacha reflects that. So a text like this that makes it clear that this was something that happened. Women's breasts habitually need to be exposed when she's nursing. And that's not a problem. That's not a halachic issue of something covered. I think suggests very strongly that women who nurse in public, women who nurse in shul, halacha doesn't, I'm not going to say halacha doesn't care, because halacha, I hope and I believe, cares very strongly that women feed their babies in the way that is best for them. And if in order to do so, that means nursing in public, then that's what works for her. And if that means nursing under a cover because that's how she's most comfortable, that's what works for her. If that means using a nursing room, if that means finding a more private location, that is what works for you and your baby. And in many ways, what halacha recognizes is that nursing is something that is fine, is normal, and belongs in shul just as much as it belongs anywhere else, because that is how we feed our babies, and that is how we allow both babies and their parents to be welcomed back into our shul and our public places. So I'm going to take the rest of my time and open it up to questions.
You have a question?
I acknowledge that you have crying babies in the back.
Yes, and that would be my son complaining in the background.
And you're doing an amazing job ignoring it and being present. And I just wanted to, acknowledge that. And thank you for being present. And I hope you can go and help if that's what you need soon. But questions?
Jessica does have a question.
Hi, thank you. And Liz, I think you were my camp counselor at Camp Nesher.
Yes. Hi.
Amazing. Hi, nice to see you again. So I am a mother of two. My youngest is 6 weeks old, and like what you said about not having bodily autonomy when you're nursing is like the most apt declaration I've ever heard. So the examples you were giving about nursing in shul and the opinions on the rabbis, really helpful to know, but just at the end part, you were saying, if you want to go to nursing room, if you want to wear a cover, that's totally your prerogative, whatever you're comfortable with. And not that I would necessarily do this, but if I was in my shul sitting in minyan and Torah reading had ended. It was Musaf. I had my baby and my baby was hungry and I wanted to literally nurse my kid with my breast out in sanctuary. Like, is that okay? Or it's that you can like nurse in the building of a synagogue, but like you should go somewhere else. And I'm not asking of like the social norms, just like from a halachic perspective.
From a halachic perspective, that's perfectly fine. Halacha thinks that it's fine to do mitzvot while nursing. Halacha thinks that it's fine to daven while nursing. There is one specific opinion that says that you shouldn't put a child down in front of a person who's davening. But that seems specifically to be like, if someone is in the middle of davening, it's a really great way to ruin their kavana to suddenly hand them a baby. If they start out davening with the baby, then there's no change in kavana. But basically, if you hand your child to your partner and say, hey, watch the baby while I daven Shemona Esrei, your partner better be in charge for the entirety of Shemona Esrei. That's on them for a little bit. But otherwise, no, halacha has no problem with you nursing in the sanctuary. It's perfectly fine.
Okay, cool. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
We have one question that came in through the chat. I'm going to just send over to you. Were there other questions that anyone wanted to get answered?
All right, so this question is about how women's body parts in relation to men. There are certainly many sources, for example, with a man saying Shema, where other parts of the women's body other than genitalia are described as erva. And that would imply to me that erva is, for yourself, is a different category than erva for a third party. So it's actually a really interesting question. When we're dealing with both sort of sanctuaries, first of all, sanctuaries with mechitza, in some ways, this question is obviated. I also think that the Ben Ish Chai is useful here as well. That when he talks about the distinction between women's breasts when they're nursing versus when they're not nursing, I would argue that that also applies to questions of erva. That even if it might be problematic to daven in front of a woman, a topless woman in general, that would actually not be true for a nursing woman because, again, her breasts are a different halachic category. I would also observe that the Gemara does know how to say the word breasts. It doesn't in that list. It actually fairly explicitly does not. And in this case, we might get into sort of the history of nursing and, I don't know, 500 years or 2,000 years of women's fashion. I will note that for most of history, legs were considered to be more scandalous than breasts, that very low cut dresses were in fashion for a significant amount of history at a time when revealing your ankle would be considered to be sort of the most horrible thing you could possibly do. So even within the realm of the Gemara, there is, and the idea that things more than merely genitalia are considered to be erva, breasts usually aren't in that category. So I would also add that as a part of it. There's another source on the source sheet that I didn't bring here that talks about why a woman's breasts are over her heart. And the first suggestion is so that the child while nursing will also drink in bina, wisdom and understanding. And the second suggestion is because unlike animals who have their dugs lower down, women's breasts are higher up so that the baby doesn't have to see any erva while nursing. And if that's a consideration, then clearly breasts are not erva. So even when we start to take into account the fact that other things may be considered erva for the purposes of tefillah, it seems to me from the sources that breasts aren't, especially nursing mothers' breasts. Okay, question came in if there's any issue with nursing in front of men. On like an objective halachic level, no. In terms of personal discomfort and people's feelings about things and the way that nursing has become complicated and politicized in the past 150 or so years, then that's something that Rabba Sara is going to talk about at her turn, and also something that I think functions outside the realm of halacha. It is possible to have a conversation about the way in which people are discomfited and negotiate around that discomfort, and also recognize that that's not actually a halachic question. Do any shuls have rules about this? I'm going to defer to Rabba Sara on that as our shul expert.
Thank you so much, Dr. Liz Shayne. And we now invite our president and co-founder, Rabba Sara Hurwitz.
Hello, everybody. I had the great pleasure of opening up this series last week and have the great pleasure of closing it up. For those of you who have been on this journey, it's been such a pleasure and honor to learn from so many Maharat graduates and students. And I want to continue this very conversation that we are having. And so to do that, I think that it is best through stories. So let me just begin with a story. And before I do, I must just acknowledge Margot Mann, who is here. The story takes me back to my nursing twin boys 16 years ago. And Margot Mann was part of that journey and story and helped me figure out how to nurse my twin baby boys while lying down at the same time. So thank you for being there for me all those years ago. So it takes me back. It was my twin boys were 3 months old. They are now 6 feet tall and 16. And they were 3 months, and I had just returned to shul, and I was already working at the Hebrew Institute of Riverdale as the Madricha Ruchanit. That was my title. I had come, and it was my turn to speak. I was giving the drasha that week, and in order to get up on the bima, I had to make sure that my kids were settled and had what they needed. And you know, I was a new mother, and I'm taking myself back to those moments of anxiety, of you know, being very worried that they would start screaming in the middle of my very brief 7-minute sermon. But you know, I guess that's just what I was thinking. And so I had to I had like timed it, or maybe there was no such thing as timing, but I remember that I had to very quickly nurse both of them before I got up on the bima. And I sat at the back of the sanctuary, and I knew that I wouldn't have time to leave the sanctuary in order to come back. And I quickly and as discreetly as possible nursed my babies. And while I was doing it, sitting all the way at the back, and I guess it must have been as the Torah was being put away, a woman came over to me and started yelling. And I didn't have time to engage because I had to nurse those babies. And so I just took it. I just took her telling me, what are you doing? Why are you nursing in shul? What, you know, you don't have a right to be here. But the ark was closing. And so all I had time to do was give my babies to Josh on the other side of the mechitza and run up to the bima. I found her afterwards during Kiddush. And I explained, I saw that you were upset at me. I didn't have time to go out of the sanctuary. And I'm sorry that I made you feel so uncomfortable, I said to her. And she looked at me and she said, you know, I stayed home for all 5 of my girls. You should make that sacrifice as well. Stay home, I thought, but I love shul and davening and community. And it's part of my job. I had to be there. So shortly after that encounter, and around also, this is 2005, I was surprised to read the following response by a rabbi to the question of whether women are allowed to nurse in shul, the very question that was just asked here a few minutes ago. It was in response to the article was in response to a tshuva that had just come out in the conservative movement, saying specifically that women could nurse in public. So one rabbi said, the issue hasn't come up. This is a direct quote. I'm going to read to you. The issue hasn't come up, he said. In the Orthodox world, there would be a general understanding that it would be best for the mother and baby to be following the traditional role of staying home. If she does come to synagogue, it would not be in the pews where she would be breastfeeding. Now I knew this rabbi, and I knew that he was squarely ensconced in the modern Orthodox community. And even in 2005, I knew that other women, in addition to myself, were breastfeeding in the pews, in shul. By now, I had begun to feel passionately about this topic. And so in my postpartum haze, I penned a letter to the editor, not usually something I have done or have really done since, but I felt that deeply about it. I'm going to read you my response. Being the Madricha Ruchanit, the spiritual mentor at the Hebrew Institute of Riverdale, and a nursing mother of 6-month-old twins, comes with its own set of challenges. But it has never occurred to me to stay at home from the pews just because I have children. Shul is a place for families, and nursing mothers should feel comfortable to modestly feed their children either in the sanctuary or in a separate room set aside for breastfeeding moms. As I nurse my boys during shul, I'm aware that some women may throw me disapproving glares. I understand and I respect their discomfort, but mainly I'm thrilled to be surrounded by women of all ages, including women who breastfeed, who are active participants in the spiritual community. We know that our place is not at home, and I'm sorry to hear that this rabbi's Orthodox world assumes inclusion of Jewish mothers. So 16 years later, I still feel the same way. Liz, who's graduating this year, Dr. Liz Shayne, and Rabbanit Jen gave us the spiritual and halachic reason for why it is mutar for women to nurse in shul. Now I want to help normalize it for all of us who want to be in shul. As Liz referenced, it may have been true that women were not always present in synagogue, perhaps because of lack of eruv, as was mentioned, or perhaps women were simply not found in the market space. In fact, the bracha she'asani kirtzono was not introduced until the 12th century to accommodate the phenomenon that women were now in the public space. I mention this only to say that there has been a precedent where there was liturgical changes introduced as it became more normal for women to be in shul. So too, should we be able to accommodate the phenomenon of breastfeeding mothers who want to be in shul as well? So I want to offer a framework for normalizing breastfeeding. Breastfeeding in public and breastfeeding specifically in shul as well. As I said above, women don't have to be in shul, and I'm grateful that women are patur. They're exempt from mitzvot shehazman grama, mitzvot that are time-bound. I love that being a mother is a central value of our tradition and halachic system. And so women who cannot come for whatever reason are patur, they're exempt. And yet they're exempt, not forbidden. It's a very specific distinction. In other words, if a woman wants to fulfill the mitzvah of, let's say, shofar or sitting in a sukkah, or even kriyat shema of davening, she has the reshut. She has the permission to do so, and she can be in shul. And indeed, some even take on the chiyuv, the obligation to do so. So we have patur, we have reshut, and we have chiyuv. We have exemptions, we have permission, reshut, and we have chiyuv, obligation. I offer this as a framework for nursing moms as well. Being a young mom is hard. Not all of us want to be in shul, especially in those early months. And in many ways, the community does not expect us to be there. We are exempt, we are patur. However, if we choose to come with our babies, that is our right, our reshut. We have permission to do so. And therefore, the community response should be one of welcome. Just like we go out of our way to help men and women alike fulfill the mitzvah of shofar, so too should the community go out of their way to make nursing moms feel comfortable. For some, that means having a clean and accessible nursing room, filled with a nursing chair with diapers, a sink, and not populated as a play space for other kids to play in or a secret location for the Kiddush Club. When we built our new shul, going back many years ago, the nursing room was a priority. And there were times that I preferred to make use of a private space. And the sanctuary, the place where we commune with God, nourish our souls, must be a place that we can also embrace moms with nursing babies, so that our davening can go interrupted. And if we so choose, can even stay to hear the rabbi or the rabbah's sermon. As far as saying that we have a chiyuv, an obligation to, so some go as far as saying some of us can go as far as saying that there is a chiyuv, an obligation to support women in public and communal prayer, if they choose. Around the same time that I wrote my op-ed, Barbara Walters, some of you probably remember this, criticized women who nurse in public, saying she was uncomfortable seeing a mom breastfeed her baby on an airplane. In response, 200 women showed up at ABC's headquarters with their babies. That comment struck a chord for many of us, because many of us have come to expect that mothers with young babies are not bound to our homes. In our modern world, we do sometimes need to leave our homes with our babies, not only going to go to the supermarket, but to go on airplanes, to work, and yes, even to shul. I'm not suggesting a breastfeeding march in shul, but I am saying that we can all play a part in normalizing breastfeeding in shul, because what that rabbi said was wrong. It would not always be best for mother and baby to be following the traditional role of staying home. So I would want to go back to that woman who yelled at me and say that women do have the right to stay home. I would tell her, I understand why you stayed home. You had that right. You have permission to do that. And that was her choice. She was patur from showing up. And perhaps it was not yet a communal norm for her to show up in shul with babies. But times are changing. They have changed. They are changing. Women have reshoot. They can, if they want, to be in the public sphere, and even feel a chiyuv, an obligation to be there. So yes, I would tell her, I have a right to be in shul, and possibly, even with my baby, me and my baby together might contribute in many ways. And doing so, we would help define what community is meant to be. A makom kadosh that is truly inclusive. And when I say inclusive, that has to come to include nursing moms and their babies as well. So before we open up for comments or questions, I want to just take a moment to thank again our co-sponsors, to JOFA and to Svivah. And again, to all the scholars who have presented, it's truly, truly been illuminating. And thank you to each of you who have joined us on this journey. So Jen, I'm turning it over to you.
Thank you all so much for being with us this evening. As we've said in the past few sessions, first of all, tomorrow, for those of you who registered, you will get an email tomorrow with the links for the recordings of all 3 sessions. If you did not register, you can still totally register, and then you'll get that email as well. And as we keep saying, if there are topics, if there are issues, if there are things that you really hope that Maharat will share content on, teach Torah on, please let us know, because this workshop came out of questions from our community, and we are happy and eager to continue to meet that need. Our